Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about first language acquisition, or how the heck do babies learn language? Because this is one of those mysterious things that we never really talk about that much. We just sort of assume that they do it because they have good parents, which is not always the case. So, speaking of having good parents, when we think about how somebody learns a language, we tend to assume if something is learned that it must be taught. And that's not exactly the case with children. Or maybe it is. Let's talk about how in a lot of a lot of parts of the US and other Western cultures, we assume it's the parents, right? Parents do all kinds of positive things to help babies and young children learn language. So they speak directly to them, they use baby talk, they treat babies as conversational participants. If the baby makes a particular noise, even though it's not what we would think of as a word, people still say, "Oh, how clever," or "Oh, did you mean such and such a thing?" So, babies are brought into conversations from a very young age. And you'll see this tendency even to extend it to people who have pets in America. You'll see a lot of people referring to pets as conversational participants too. And I think that there's probably a pretty overlapping Venn diagram of those communities that address babies and pets in conversation. So, we do have other cultures, even in the US though, if you'll look at the Tracton example on page 82, that they don't try to interpret preverbal sounds. To them, it's just noise. They're like, "Hey, the baby made a noise. Fascinating." It's not a sign of the baby trying to participate in a conversation. It's just the baby creating sounds. There's no baby talk in this community or direct conversation with the baby. Nobody looks at a preverbal child and asks, "How is it doing today?" Or when the child makes an inarticulate noise, nobody says, "Oh, do you want milk?" They just assume as the adult and the caregiver of this person that they know what the child wants, and there's no need for this kind of charade of how do you feel or what exactly do you want. So this brings us to a couple interesting questions. One, is baby talk useful? So, do we do children a disservice by simplifying syntax and vocabulary and all these other features of language in order to reach these children? Or should we be providing them with well-formed, meaningful expressions in what will be the child's native language and saying, "Look, here's how it sounds and here's what we expect you to replicate"? And perhaps we also have the more fundamental question, do we need to teach language? Or does it just happen? So, we have this myth, or maybe I'm doing a disservice by calling it a myth. Let's call it a prevailing point of view that has critics, of the 30 million word gap. And what this is based on is a study that said that children of higher income families are exposed to approximately 30 million more words than children of lower income families. And by this, they mean people talking to the child, not just words that are experienced in the house. So, this premise is related to Stephen Krashen's theory of comprehensible input. I'm going to put some links up on Canvas so you can learn a little bit more about Krashen. But comprehensible input essentially means that something is given to you that is meaningful, or it's not so foreign to you that you can't make meaning out of it. So, for instance, if you are a second language speaker of English and you have come to America and you can understand 70% of a sentence that somebody gives to you, then the rest of it is likely to be comprehensible input. It's something that you have enough context to hang on to that says, hey, I can figure out the rest of this sentence because I have enough other knowledge to support that. I can make this logical leap. Now, if I have never studied Russian and somebody drops me off in the middle of St. Petersburg, I'm going to have problems. This input that I'm going to get in Russian by native Russian speakers is not comprehensible to me. This is something that is so far out of my experience that it's just noise. So that's what comprehensible input is. It's something within your grasp. You may have to reach for it a little bit, you may have to stand on your tiptoes, but it's within your grasp. So you get meaningful input, and then you use it to build your own systems. So you file it into this world that you're building for yourself, and that's how comprehensible input helps children and really anybody acquiring a second language to be able to make sense of what is going on around them. This fits with Noam Chomsky's view of universal grammar too. We talked about this in class a little bit previously, but just to review, universal grammar is essentially the black box of linguistic acquisition. So we have something in our minds that predisposes us to learn and create language from birth. We can create a language when there isn't one, and we'll talk about this some, or create rules for a language when that language may not actually have rules as yet. We'll talk about that when we get to pidgins and creoles in a few minutes. But we are constantly trying to take this comprehensible input that we get from the people who speak a language around us and file it into a system so that we can create language. That's sort of one of our main drives as children, is to understand and create language. The 30 million word gap basically posits because higher income children are exposed to more comprehensible input, they necessarily are going to have a richer linguistic system. Stephen Krashen would totally agree. The more comprehensible input, the better off you are. Noam Chomsky would tell us the more comprehensible input, the faster your universal grammar is going to be able to help you parse a language. Now, there is some debate about at what age we lose access to universal grammar, or if we do. There are certainly people who say we do not, but a lot of the people, particularly Americans who've tried to learn a second language in high school, might beg to differ. So, is it as simple as talk to children more and they'll have a richer linguistic ability? Probably not. If it were, then we would be doing this much more regularly. So, nothing in language is really this simple. Is it an enticing kind of an idea? Does it make us feel happy? Oh yes, this sounds really great, right? If I talk to my baby, it's necessarily going to be more verbal, which Americans at the very least equate to more intelligent. It will have better opportunities. Hooray, I'm going to sit down and talk to my baby nonstop. So, let's let that kind of ferment in our brains for a little while, and let's talk about the evidence for universal grammar. So, this is the magical black box in our head. There's some evidence that we have it. One of them is rule-driven errors in speech. This is when children will say, I saw 3 gooses in the park, rather than 3 geese. Geese obviously is an irregular plural. This is going to be something that's children are going to have trouble with. You'll also see something that we call in second language acquisition U-shaped learning. And that's where somebody appears to have a rule, things are going well, their child is saying dogs and parks and boxes and all the kinds of plural things that are surrounding it. But suddenly, they're not doing that anymore. They're doing much worse at forming plurals and things like that. So they appear to not be doing something that they were previously able to do. This goes along with another idea we have in second language acquisition, which is called a silent period. And sometimes people who are learning a second language will just stop producing language for a while. They just don't do it. And what this is basically your brain reformatting your hard drive. You've gotten some information that's bugging you. For instance, why do we say geese instead of gooses? What is the reason for this? And while your brain is reformatting what you understand about language, you're not going to have access to everything for a while. So you'll see U-shaped learning, but the reason we call it a U is because while it goes up, up, up for a while, and then it comes down, but it's going to come back up even higher. That's why we call it U-shaped learning. You'll also see children who receive imperfect input learn language differently. So that gives us some sense that they are going to, you'll see children who have parents who speak imperfectly. Obviously, we know the prescriptive and descriptive ramifications of saying that, but who speak a non-standard dialect or have a less rule-governed dialect, often because they are second language speakers of the language that is going to become the child's first language. And the child will still learn the first language to a native degree. So if you look at the example on page 86 of Simon, his parents were second language speakers of sign, and yet Simon learns how to sign better than his parents. So the grammatical markers that his parents often left out in their signing, Simon could do perfectly. Is this because of universal grammar? Is he receiving less errorful input from other sources? Probably a combination of the two. But despite having imperfect input, children will still learn their native language. I dislike saying perfectly, but they will learn it to a native level, even though the people who are ostensibly teaching them the language do not speak it to that degree. Coming back to the idea of pidgins and creoles, remember there are no native speakers of a pidgin. If you're a native speaker of a pidgin, it is essentially become a creole. We don't recognize it as such until we have a stable base of native speakers of that creole, and they're basically agreeing on the grammatical rules that mark that system. Pidgins do have some shared grammatical features, but it doesn't rise to the same level of being grammatical rules in a sense of we can make sweeping generalizations about this. Pidgins are survival languages. You have things I would like to trade with you, I would like to declare war on you so I can have the things you have that I would like, whatever. But typically they are related to trade and harmonious communication, because if you didn't want to communicate with somebody, you would just hit them and take their things, which doesn't require its own language. But that is neither here nor there. But creoles tend to be relatively complex grammatically, and people argue the popular theory is that children are the driving force behind the rule-driven shift of a pidgin, and because essentially children are agreeing and developing these grammatical rules, unconsciously. It's not like they sit around on the playground and say, well, how shall we teach the imperfect verb form? Or what shall it look like? Well, what about for this verb? This is entirely unconscious, which is kind of magical, which does give us maybe some credence toward universal grammar, because for the same reason a lot of native speakers can't pick out a subjunctive form if their life depends on it. They know it when they hear it and they can produce it, whether they know what to call it or not. So, do children always learn their native language perfectly? Universal grammar tells us that they should, right? Yes and no. Typically, yes. However, you may find production restraints because of physical barriers, people with facial deformities or malformations. We've talked about that some in class. Even people like me who have relatively large overbites, they will replicate sounds imperfectly. You'll see sometimes processing languages challenges, such as specific language impairment, SLI, which essentially means that the universal grammar black box isn't there. And that these people are more than average intelligence, or at least what we would consider average intelligence, but they can't render their thoughts linguistically. You'll see aphasias where people get brain injuries, things like that. These things are relatively rare, but they do happen. Or if a child just doesn't get comprehensible input, so kind of the classic raised by wolves scenario. If a child is raised by wolves and the wolves don't happen to speak English, unlike the Disney version of the Jungle Book, then the child is simply not going to learn a language. So you do need to have comprehensible input as far as we know. So, if we take the 30 million word gap at face value, we know that child language develops faster when parents talk more, when they use a wider vocabulary, they ask questions and engage children in interactions. We tend to see a lot of praise and affirmation. Oh, that's such a good job. You're such a clever child. Wow, that's perfect, etc., etc. And it boils down to more comprehensible input is better. Does this sound like the way a lot of us were raised? Probably. Is this culturally determined, though? Are we simply confirming our own biases and setting up experiments that do this? Let's think about the ways that we measure linguistic ability. So, Western societies, we tend to value production. We're very individualistic. We want to be recognized as individuals, and one of the ways we do this is by producing language so that we can take up our share of the space on stage, if you will. But what if you come from a culture where children are not encouraged to talk when adults are around? If it's very much a seen, not heard kind of a scenario. Does that make a difference to your linguistic aptitude if you're being measured by a Western speaker or a Western researcher? Probably. If we have a checklist of words and say, okay, let's see how many words this group of children knows out of what we would consider an average vocabulary for a first grader, think about the kind of classic examples of standardized testing when people were first conducting research into the culturally biased ways that standardized tests work. And children who came from a food desert were asked to identify a banana, but they'd never seen one before, or a pineapple, right? So These tend to be very culturally rooted. This is a pony. Okay, well, middle class children who are exposed to PBS are going to know exactly what a pony is. If you are from a very urban background and you don't have those same kind of exposures, this tiny horse might be a matter of great puzzlement for you. Recording everything seems like the most fair way, but we have to make a decision about what morphemes are thrown out. So, if a child is producing what may appear to be gibberish to a researcher who's coding this data, how does that researcher know if it is a word in a particular dialectal variant, or if it is really just gibberish? A lot of times the answer for that is, I'm going to compare it to the dictionary. If it's not in the dictionary, it's not a word. Do we all use words every day that are not in the standard dictionary? I know I do. Or another corpus, right? So when we're consulting a standardized, monolithic, this is part of language, this is not part of language, that's going to necessarily exclude some variants and different kinds of language production in a way that can be very culturally determined. If we say, all right, well, let's see how they do with grammatical rules. We've already talked to a great extent about how tense in AAVE is radically different than tense in standard American English, and in a lot of senses is more complicated. So, if a child uses the correct tense, as in the example in the book about when the teacher asks the child where his mother is at and he says she'd be home, and they're like, well, but she's not at home, and the child is crying and it's like, why do you make me lie? Would that be recorded as errorful? Standardized tests, we've already talked about a bit. Bias towards certain groups, not in it's funny to us to make students from different cultural backgrounds fail kind of a way, but because we don't realize the kind of knowledge that we take for granted. It also may not privilege kinds of information that mark other groups. In the textbook, it talks about the working class mothers telling stories to their children 3 times as often as middle class mothers. In that society, storytelling is a work of intelligence. It's a marker of linguistic aptitude that middle class children may not be readily displaying in the same way. So that is where we're going to leave this discussion for right now. I want you to think about, what does it mean to acquire a language? When we talk about language, what are we doing? What are we producing? When we say a child is advanced in terms of their use of language, what kind of behaviors are we actually identifying? So, you have a couple of reflections that you're going to be completing for this week. I assume you're all busily working on your final papers. As usual, if you have any questions, feel free to email me, or if you want to have a virtual meeting, send me that email, tell me a time that works for you, and I'll be happy to meet. Other than that, have a great week, and I will talk to you soon.